Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring the profound, and honestly, the enduring impacts of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. We're going to unpack not just how a nuclear reactor blew up in the heart of the Soviet Union, but how that single explosion literally sent shockwaves through history. It shattered lives, exposed a massive state cover-up, and left this toxic legacy that has chillingly resurfaced in modern times.
I want you to just take a second and imagine standing in the exact room where history fractured. We have this quote from the source material. I think what's most powerful for me is just being in a room, in a place, and next to a button that, when it was pressed, changed the world. That room? It was the control center of Unit 4 at the Chernobyl power plant. And when that fatal button was pressed, well, the world was truly never the same again. Let's look at exactly how it all went down.
Section 1. The Epicenter. Anatomy of a Meltdown.
So, our story begins with a catastrophic failure, a mix of both engineering flaws and broken human procedure. A nuclear reactor, is essentially just an incredibly complex steam engine. Normally, nuclear uranium rods react through fission, and that creates immense heat. This heat converts water into steam, which then spins turbines to generate electricity. The vital safety net here is the cooling water pumped around the core, along with control rods that can be inserted to slow the reaction down. But what happens when that safety net is compromised by its very design?
Well, the core philosophy behind the Soviet RBMK reactor design was flawed right from the start. The Soviets wanted these plants to be this ultimate symbol of communist strength and autonomy, and to achieve that, they prioritized cheap, local construction and rapid energy production way over vital safety mechanisms. They essentially sidelined safety just to hit economic goals. They even declared it was absolutely impossible for a nuclear power plant to explode.
Let's look at how all this builds into an absolute catastrophe on April 25th and 26th, 1986. Operators were trying to run a safety test. At 2 p.m., they intentionally turned off the emergency core cooling system. But then, the test got delayed by electricity demands until the night shift finally took over at midnight. Now, these workers had way less experience with this specific procedure. By 1:23 a.m., power levels had dropped dangerously low, so they removed vital control rods to boost the power, and then they initiated the test. Suddenly, the power surged. They slammed the emergency stop button to insert the control rods, but the rods jammed. At 1:24 a.m., a massive steam explosion ripped the 1,000-ton roof right off the reactor, expelling a glowing fireball of radioactive material into the night sky.
Section 2. The First Ripple. A Culture of Sacrifice.
This explosion created an immediate, terrifying human cost, and it was built upon a culture where citizens were entirely expected to sacrifice themselves for the state. Just listen to Grigory, a fire engine driver who arrived just minutes after the explosion. He said, "We saw graphite lying everywhere. I kicked a bit of it. Neither of us had any idea of radiation. Firefighters arrived completely unprotected. They were pouring water onto a nuclear fire while literally kicking chunks of the highly radioactive core. They simply didn't know they were walking directly into a lethal, invisible fire." And the immediate consequence for these incredibly brave first responders was acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. When radiation hits the human body at these colossal levels, we're talking 400 times higher than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It damages cells at the fundamental DNA level. Symptoms like vomiting and extreme weakness, they occur almost immediately. Within weeks and months, so many of those initial firefighters died in absolute agony from the severe illness. The contrast that morning was just horrific. In the nearby utopian city of Pripyat, just a few miles away, children went to school as normal. Weddings literally proceeded on April 26th. Citizens were kept entirely in the dark. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground was straight out of an apocalypse. Soldiers in gas masks were guarding buildings as the air filled with fatal radiation. The illusion of normalcy was meticulously maintained while a catastrophe unfolded right next door.
Section 3. The Second Ripple. The Calculated Soviet Cover-Up.
As this massive radioactive cloud blew across Europe, the Soviet state went into full suppression mode. They tried desperately to hide the accident, to protect their international image. But here's the thing about radiation, it doesn't respect borders. On April 28th, air monitors at a nuclear plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, detected unusually high radiation. It wasn't until these Swedish scientists raised the alarm and actively pressured Moscow that the Soviet Union finally admitted on television that an accident had occurred. And that was 36 hours later. What is frankly devastating is what happened a few days later, on May 1st. In Kyiv and Minsk, traditional May Day parades proceeded exactly as planned. Citizens marched under patriotic red flags, completely unaware that invisible clouds of fatal radiation were drifting right overhead. And what's even more telling, the high-ranking party elites were noticeably absent from these celebrations. The state literally exposed its own people to radiation just to keep up an official facade.
Section 4. The invisible human cost. Throwing people at the problem.
Controlling this disaster required a massive, totally unprecedented cleanup effort. Because the radiation was so intense, robots literally broke down. So the Soviet Union brought in over 600,000 people, known as liquidators. Listen to this chilling instruction given to Estonian soldiers who were tasked with shoveling radioactive graphite off the reactor roof. You have 1 minute to complete the task. Work so hard in this minute that you remember it for the rest of your life. These young, healthy men were sent up in crude lead aprons to do an impossible job. Many received their entire lifetime limit of radiation in just 60 seconds.
So, there is a massive historical blank spot regarding the actual casualties of this disaster. The official Soviet death toll remained at exactly 31 people, just 31. But when you look at other estimates, like the UN's 4,000, or high-end estimates reaching all the way up to 93,000, you see the staggering gap. Because no comprehensive, transparent medical study was set up at the time, and information was strictly suppressed, we honestly may never know the true human cost of this disaster. The long-term fallout was devastating. Over 115,000 people were told they were leaving Pripyat for 3 days. Well, they never returned. Local children suffered immense surges in thyroid cancer and leukemia, largely because the government failed to distribute preventative iodine in time. Astoundingly, medical books that even mentioned radiation were physically hidden from local doctors trying to treat patients. In total, the UN estimates 8.4 million Soviet citizens were exposed to the radiation.
Section 5. The global ripple, collapse, and modern threats. The shock waves of Chernobyl, they didn't just stay in 1986. The handling of the disaster was a massive turning point in global history. The profound loss of public trust and the undeniable realization that state propaganda was just a complete lie deeply undermined the Soviet system. The public anger fueled protests and pro-independence movements, particularly in Ukraine and Belarus, acting as a major catalyst that accelerated the total collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. 24,000. That is the estimated number of years the Chernobyl exclusion zone will remain dangerously radioactive and unsafe for human habitation. Let that sink in. 24,000 years. That is a legacy that outlasts empires. It's an area frozen in time, heavily restricted, where you can only be exposed for incredibly short amounts of time.
But this threat isn't just historical. Fast forward to 2022, and invading Russian troops marched straight across this toxic landscape. They held the plant staff hostage for 5 weeks and unbelievably dug military trenches right into the highly radioactive soil. The site of the world's worst nuclear disaster was abruptly turned back into an active war zone, complete with the threat of missile attacks and drone strikes threatening the power grid and the massive structure now encasing Reactor 4.
Yet through all of this, the human element perseveres. Consider the reality for local Ukrainian staff today. As the source states, they keep turning up and doing their job, which is to keep that radiation in the confinement facility. And that's just not for Ukraine, that's to keep all of us safe. Operating in rotating shifts amidst air raid sirens and active conflict, these workers continue to monitor the ruins of Reactor 4 to prevent another disaster.
Which leaves us with an absolutely crucial question. With Chernobyl caught in an active war zone, will history's worst nuclear disaster remain in the past? It's a stark reminder that the ripples of 1986 are still crashing against our modern world, and the fragile security of this radioactive legacy requires constant vigilance. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep looking deeper into the forces that shape our world.